Hi, I'm Dr. Laura McLauchlan. I'm an honorary lecturer with the Environment and Society group here at UNSW.
And I'm Tema Milstein. I'm an associate professor in Environment Society here at UNSW, and I'm also convener of our master's program.
Hi, Tema.
Hello, Laura.
Hi. Okay. So we're here today to talk. Some of our talks are going to be focused on Tema's recent co-publication, which is a really exciting collection of works, all thinking about ecocultural identity and what that might mean for the world. So that's the Routledge Handbook of Ecocultural Identity that's come out this year. But we're also going to be thinking about that in the context of both of our work too, because it really does, speak to a lot of things. There are the reasons that we do what we do. So before we get to the handbook, Tema, I was wondering, would you just want to say a little bit maybe about the kind of work that you do?
Absolutely. I am focused on our environmental relations as they manifest through our cultures, through our cultural lenses, through the ways we engage with each other, through our perceptions, and specifically through our discourses, which really is about our symbolic and material ways of being. So you could think of it as environmental communication or ecocultural communication. How are we constantly producing our environmental selves with each other in groups, but also in wider societies at policy levels. So I'm really curious about that. And I focus on everything from environmental meaning systems in dominant Western discourse to environmental meaning systems in global South communities that are in transformation. And I focused on ecotourism and environmental activism. And I also am really interested in ecopedagogy, or the ways that we teach about our environmental relations in ways that can be transformative. What about you?
So we've got some happy crossovers here, which is why I think one of the many reasons that it's such a lovely group to be working as part of. But so my training is in anthropology, mostly in my background, but I just came to see that it didn't make sense to ever be just studying humans as if we existed as just something separate from the world around us. So, but it wasn't really until around 2010 that it became possible to say I'm an anthropologist who actually looks at the human as being more than just a single organism. So my technical title would be that I'm a multi-species ethnographer. So that means both looking at a whole lot of different species as we all hang out together, but also really questioning what a species is, and really starting to focus on the kinds of relations that make us all, which I see as a real commonality of, in our research interests.
Absolutely, and our group is transdisciplinary, right? I mean, our group is coming from all sorts of different disciplines, and most of our individual work is across disciplines, which it has to be, right, when you're dealing with environment and society.
Absolutely, and I think there has been that real frustration, and I think for a lot of us, like a lot of people will say in our crew that like I never quite fitted in any particular discipline because we were always seeing those links, that whatever, the economics affects our environment, affects, our discourse, affects all these things are interconnected. And as a bit of a segue in that, I feel like these are ideas that are really celebrated in your handbook, and that you really kind of, it's a really amazing tool for actually thinking about what these kinds of interconnections mean for us. I was just wondering, could you tell us, like, what is this thing, ecocultural identity, that your handbook is actually about, and a term that you've introduced into the world?
Right.
Well,
I think a term that really needed and needs to be introduced, right? Because we often think of ourselves as social beings or as cultural beings, but and when I say we, I'm thinking dominant cultural discourse, often don't think of ourselves as ecological beings. And so the idea behind the notion of ecocultural identity, it's a framework that's introduced in this handbook to give us a different way of thinking about ourselves. and this is also an ancient way of thinking, right? It's not a new way of thinking, right? I mean, in many, if not most, indigenous cultures, environment is not separate from society, from self, which is one of the reasons that most indigenous cultures have been so not just sustainable but regenerative. And so, so this notion of ecocultural identity, and the reason that we're bringing this forth, me and my co-editor José Castro-Sotomayor, is to create this way of understanding selfhood and communities and ways of being with an expanded scope. So it's not just a sociocultural scope, but it's an expanded scope where we widen our lens on selfhood, so that we always understand that the social, the cultural dimensions of ourselves are inseparable from the ecological dimensions. And so when we think about identity in this way, we're not just talking about identities that are environmentalist identities or people who are, already feeling a kinship, but it's every kind of identity, right? So
yeah,
every possible one.
So if you're not, because you're saying about this is really about the sociocultural being inseparable from the ecological, so that if my sociocultural identity is one that actually says stuff the environment, or I'm, I don't know, really wedded to this way of consuming, that's also part of my ecocultural identity.
Absolutely, right. And the ecological parts of those identities have become invisible and even deniable, right? So if we can understand every identity as always ecocultural, and whether it's a protective identity or a destructive one, right? Whether it's extractive or restorative, whether it's complacent or creative, et cetera, right? All of these identities that we carry around with us. And I think it's most important, in fact, to look at the ones where it seems like, oh, there's no environmental aspect to this identity, right? I live in the middle of the city and, I work in a bank. No, that's also, that identity has ecological dimensions that are always intertwined with every identity has ecological dimensions. So that's our idea here, is how can we start to shift, to provide a language and to provide a pathway to start to have this conversation across all ways of being.
And I see that as, so some of my other work as well is also looking at, I also teach literary studies at NYU University here in Sydney as well, and really thinking there about the ways that language massively matters in terms of how we see ourselves. And I love this idea too of actually the way that language actually makes a pathway here for a different way of seeing, and that actually as a researcher you're introducing a new term that potentially is participating in those bigger ecologies.
Right. I mean, it's really interesting to think about, how does our language get in our way, right? Because our language is a productive force, right? And so the whole notion of the environment, right, as something that is, if we think about how it's used in most Western discourses, it's when we think of environment, it's often something that's separate from humanity, right? It's this thing out there, it's this backdrop, but it's not something that humanity is an integral part of. It's not an immersive space that everything is immersed in, and we're being immersed in as well. We're not just immersing ourselves, but there's many that are immersed in us, right? When you think about COVID, when you think about the bushfire ripping through our communities or going into our lungs, I mean, all of the ways that that we are an integral bodies. And it's interesting, the whole notion of discourses and the ways we talk, and if we start to understand ourselves as these thickly storied beings, right, we can start to understand ourselves in ways that are many grouped. So a lot of identity scholars talked about intersectionality, and that usually refers to race and gender and sexuality and class, and the ways that different aspects of us intersect, right, and intervene, and how we and we're seeing that a lot right now in uprisings around the world, right, around race specifically. And one of the the goals of this book is to start to expand intersectionality. So we start to understand ourselves as also our more than human groupings, right? These human groupings are really important, but what are our more than human groupings? And how does that lead to acknowledgements and to sharing questions and concerns and actions regarding how we live, right? How do we have a collective course of living? And that's based on equity and justice and interdependence, which is a reality that we all share.
Absolutely. And I really love that notion too of, you know, how is it that we can come to see ourselves as being our more than human groupings. And what a shift that is, to think of myself as a grouping, you know, rather than being just this singular being.
Right. I mean, our groupings are like, right, you and I both study mammals, right? We study human relations with mammals. You, in one instance, hedgehogs, me in one instance, cetaceans, right? Whales and dolphins, and how people relate to these other beings. But part of that relationship that relating is that we're all mammals, right? That we breathe oxygen, but then there's differences, right? Who's the land dweller? Who are the ocean dwellers? But we're all bodies of water, right? But then, and so to continue forward in these ways of relating beyond the human-centric realm that has really been detrimental to our ways of moving through the world in a dominant way, which is, I mean, colonization is in there. There's so much, right, that's tied up in these hierarchies that and it's time that they're actually being undone.
Yeah. Yep, absolutely. And the thing that I'd love to hear a bit more about as well is, you know, you spoke about that we're not always seeing those more than human groupings of which we're a part of, and that kind of, in that sense too of, you know, it's just of love for other beings and for life, and, you know, for the ways that we come together. And I just love to also hear, because, you know, part of what we're doing, and, you know, we could be doing this work not necessarily in academia too, but, you know, we're still here, you're doing research as well. And I'd love to hear a little bit more about how your work actually connects with your particular research, and how that's actually, you know, come out of the work that you've done.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, this handbook, so the handbook has 40 authors, right? It's how many chapters? 28 chapters, and I'm gonna give the context of this to then go into how it came about. I mean, there's everything from David Abram, who's a cultural ecologist, well known, who talks about interbreathing and what interbreathing does to our notions of selves, but also he puts forth this idea of the Humilocene instead of the Anthropocene, this age of humility and also humiliation, and how does, I love this idea of shifting us into a more ethical stance with our current epoch, right? And there's folks looking at borderland ecocultural identities between Mexico and the US. There's people looking at also borderlands, like warring borderlands and identities there. People looking at ancient ecocultural identities and how kind of the first Western major patriarchal societies in Greece really introduced the whole notion of a dominator ecocultural identity over other animals. And also ancient ecocultural identities, not quite as ancient in Hawaii, pre-colonization. There's people looking at family stories and dealing with race and gender and urban and rural, and people looking at interspecies cohabitation between humans and elephants. It goes on and on. I mean, there are many chapters in here, but everything from hunters and ranchers and evangelical Christians in the US to canal dwellers in Bangkok and miners in Ghana and farmers in Sweden. So it goes on and on. I'm not going to talk about all the chapters, but I'm really excited about what emerged in this project. And all of this research is original research, and it's all building original theory. And it all came out of this seed from my own research, which is ethnographic. I do, like you, ethnographic work, which means, you know, going out and being in a lived experience and listening for the meanings that are emerging in those spaces, and to gain insight about what's going on in our cultures and in our world. And a lot of my work over the last 15 or so years has been focused on relationships with whales and dolphins, and specifically mostly around relationships with orcas, endangered orcas in North America. And out of all this work, not just in that site, what I kept on hearing was people who were even the most dedicated people, the people who had dedicated their lives to protecting other animals, denigrating themselves when they spoke of that love. And I know you experienced this as well in your own work.
Massively so. So yeah, in my work with hedgehogs and people who love, part of it was with people who love hedgehogs and are looking out for them. Hugely, you know, so people who would say, yeah, I'm so stupid, you know, so I'm just stupid about animals, was something that I heard a lot actually in my research. And I've heard it, and it's here too. So in your chapter in the handbook as well, you say, you know, you quote one of the, I think she's a tour guide, no, she's a naturalist, and tour naturalist, and she says, I can't believe, you know, she's seeing orca and getting really excited about seeing these beautiful beings, and she squeals and says, I can't believe I did my most unprofessional squeal in front of you, a researcher. And, you know, as if it's not okay to be loving these creatures, and also, you know, understanding them, as if those things can't go together, that we need to kind of write off that affective, loving part of ourselves if we want to be seen as being legit researchers.
Maybe I can add here the story I open up my chapter with, because I think it can also, it ties in with a lot of what we're thinking about right now in society. Yeah, the one with the worms.
Yes,
exactly.
With worms.
So, and this is about just an interaction I had with a student when I was living in Seattle and teaching at the University of Washington, and it was pounding rain outside. And what happens in Seattle when it rains is all the worms go for a journey. And so as you're walking down the sidewalk, you'll see worms just streaming across the pavement, but they do so, they elongate their bodies. And so they look like these just wet stripes. And when you first come to Seattle, it's hard to know what this is. And then if you look closer, you see what it is. And most people just walk over them and on them and kill them. And so after, you know, a day or two later, you'll see all these dried up worms who were stepped on. And so I was having this conversation with my student, and she, and for context, she was a firefighter. She was an out lesbian. She presented herself very butch. And so she had a lot of bravery around these identities that were not dominant identities, right? And putting those forward. So that's context for this conversation that I'm about to reveal. So she and I were talking about this, and she said, yeah, God, it takes me so long to get home when it's raining here, because, you know, I stop every square of sidewalk and I remove the worms one by one. And you know, if someone walks by, I just pretend I'm tying my shoe. And it's that moment, right, of covering up that care. And you write a lot about the cares, the whole notion of care and what that means. That was so striking to me, and then kind of tied together all of the things I've been hearing in my research of people not, in many ways, denigrating their own relationships with a more than human, even though those were in many cases the most meaningful to them, but also doing it to others as well. So disciplining others when they did that, making fun of or silencing, or there's all sorts of different ways that this happens.
And there's a term that you use that I really, really appreciate, which is, you talk about actually boundary patrols. And it is that real sense that I get of people actually, both for themselves and others, you know, really policing those boundaries between this idea of the human as being something that's separate from life more generally. And I think for me that's a really important, and I'm just conscious we're at time, it's gone so fast, Tema, but for me it's actually really challenging that kind of policing, that both, well, I think both our work really tries to actually challenge those kinds of really destructive boundaries, both destructive to our environments, but also I think to having a really joyful, connected life.
Yes. Yes.
And I just, and in this handbook too, I mean, it's such a really useful term, this idea of ecocultural identity, and how that actually also can help us to really challenge those sorts of, I think, really harmful boundaries, and how this new language can be a tool in that.
Yeah, it was. I'm glad you're bringing up the notion of boundary control, and I think it's because it's when I started to realize this was about identity, human identity, right? Is what is a dominant human, and so anthropocentrism or human centrism is very central. It's kind of a core cultural premise of dominant Western ways of being. Right? And there's other hierarchies, and isms that attach to that, right? There's all sorts of intersections, and I think it was when I started to notice the boundary control that I started to understand this as we're reproducing certain selves, even with people who might be very brave in other ways, right, or very revolutionary, or very pushing the boundaries in other ways, right? It's the boundary of anthropocentrism that is the most perhaps tenacious, right? Because in many ways we define progress on exploitation and extraction from a kind of a non-living, non-spirited world. And so there's a lot invested in patrolling those boundaries.
Yeah.
And so that's where the idea of the handbook came from. As I started talking about this with my PhD students, and Jose, my co-editor, is a former PhD student of mine, he started to think about it in the context of his work with indigenous communities in Ecuador and Colombia. And we started to have conversations with other scholars, and then realizing, oh, this is way beyond one or two disciplines, right? And so the authors of the chapters are international, and they're from
transdisciplinary.
Exactly. This is so many, right? We can look at psychology, we can look at education, we could look at even planning. We can look at environmental studies.
And we have to.
We must
as well.
Yeah, absolutely. And I know we want to draw this to a close, but I know that we were talking about, okay, what are some different ways of making change? I mean, there's all sorts of change making happening right now, right? And it's absolutely necessary and time. I don't know, what are your thoughts in terms of how our kind of work can do that?
That was actually the final thing that was coming up for me too, was actually, I just wrote down, you can see here in my little notes as you're speaking, I've got here, research is also activism. And also having really, as well, and I think this is in part of both of our research, of actually hearing those quiet stories of people recognizing their connection with the living world around them, that they're a part of it and loving it. And, in ethnography, often we can be privy to those kinds of quiet stories that maybe, we don't share publicly because it's not always safe to actually say, like, my life is meaningful because of my connection with this tree, or, because of the swim I take in the ocean that actually, is something that matters to me hugely. And those kinds of loves that actually really matter to us. And I think for me, like, change making is actually telling those stories.
Bringing them to light and creating spaces for transformation, right? I think that we often can think we're just in our little bubble and this is just my experience. But I think ethnography can start to, look at this, is now illuminated as something that is a shared experience.
Exactly. And then you just don't know, like, who else on my street might also actually be feeling this way? That person up there I've never thought about. Maybe it's actually hearing the birds singing outside you know, outside their window in the morning that matters, or that the snail that, like, you know, crosses their path, or, you know, whatever connection it is that actually makes their life be meaningful and worthwhile, but we're not necessarily talking about it. And I think these sorts of connections, just to get us wondering. Yeah.
And shared braveries, right? I mean, I think it can help us wonder, and also then lead to a sense of collective understandings that are different from the status quo. Because I think we can assume most people believe this way because it's a dominant discourse, but we actively partake in reproducing that dominant discourse. So if we can start to think, wait a second, I can also be a transformative force with others, right? And others might be receptive to this. I don't have to shut this down. Then an alternative way of being that is really a renewed way of being, right? It's a way of being that we've had for thousands and thousands and thousands of years. The way we have been, kind of our industrialized, colonizer selves, is relatively recent in our species history, and certainly very, very recent in the history of the planet.
Absolutely. And yeah, and in having these kinds of brave conversations that I think we're actually participating in right now, that can also make a space, you know, to say, actually, we're part of these other ways of being and thinking about the world. And yeah, and the conversations that then potentially can be contagious in the happy way.
And move from the interpersonal to the structural, right? So it's really, I mean, we're all co-constructing our societies always, right? All of these things are constructions that we take part in every day, that we kind of assume have always been there, right? Everything's dynamic, everything's in flux, and we're creating that flux, and we're creating the new realities. So to think about the interpersonal as so essential for policy change, for you know, entire new ways of being.
Massively. And I think that is, and I know we definitely think we've just gone over time because we've both gotten excited, but I think of that as, in terms of feminist models of change making too, that the huge changes that have happened, you know, even in the past like 30 years, you know, around, I think around queerness and women's rights. And a lot of those have happened out of conversations. And then people also, like you said, going then to do that kind of structural work as well, you know, of fighting to have things recognised. But that they often, you know, in Indigenous fights too, you know, so often start from like people getting together and actually being brave enough to say what's going on. And then the change that actually comes out of that. And I think this is part of that as well, of actually recognizing those ecological connections.
And it's, I think what I'm hoping with the handbook is it's a different way of noticing, right? Yeah, because I think that we need some different ways of noticing really quickly. And so I'm hoping it'll be taken on by people, not just in academia, but also in practice, by practitioners, by politicians, right, by activists, and start to become a way of doing, not just perceiving, but also doing.
Beautiful. And I think that's us at time.
Awesome.
So here's to new ways of noticing. And
yay.
New old ways.
Yay. Hey, thanks so much, Laura. I'm glad we got to do this.
So much, Emma.